Shabbat shalom, everyone. One day I would love to be watching Jeopardy and to have this question come up. Name one or two books of the Bible that does not include the name of God even once. There are people here who would go ding ding, ring in, and so what is Megillat Esther? Anyone want to get double jeopardy for the second point? Yes, what is Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs? And so, it's not a surprise, I think a lot of people here in this room knew this, that God's name does not appear a single time, our rabbis agree, in the story of Esther. But, they say, that does not mean God's not there in the details. So there are three primary schools of thought when it comes to the book of Esther. And this first one is primarily held by academics. And they hold that this is one of those rare books which does not contain God's name at all due to what they call an accident of authorship. The scholars who hold this perspective point out that the book of Esther is many things. It's a political comedy. It's an ancient warning against Jew hatred. It's a little bit of light frivolity, and it's more than a little bit scandalous. It is, after all, starring a protagonist who, besides being a woman, is also an intermarried, assimilated Jew who has assumed a Babylonian name and identity and buys into the pleasures of the diaspora. What is the Megillah not, according to them? Well, it's not actually a religious text at all. To these scholars, it is not that the book is not holy enough to have God's name in it, but rather that its inclusion in our Tanakh as a whole is a bit of what they call a happy accident. According to them, it's a leftover bit of writing that survived and then grew popular and thrived and was preserved. It was written without God in it because it's not part of the genre of stories that would include any kind of religious language at all. Let's open up a modern parable. And in our mind's eye, go to your remote and open up the Netflix of your mind. You're scrolling through the different categories, and there, amongst all of the Marvel blockbusters, you see a strange little romantic comedy. And 2,000 years later, this is the equivalent of everyone looking at the story and wondering, why isn't anyone on screen wearing a costume? The second perspective, which is slightly more fringe, but was often favored by Zionist thinkers before the establishment of the State of Israel, is that the Megillah leaves out God's name on purpose, to teach its readers a valuable lesson. And depending on the scholar, that lesson may well vary, but most of them are variants upon the idea that God no longer takes an active hand in our world now that our temple has been destroyed. It is this school of thought that says the Jewish people need to defend themselves from Amalek, because God will not be miraculously intervening in our wars anymore. And Esther's placement in history, taking place during the Babylonian exile, others argue, is another reason for God's missing presence. That these theologians believe that since we are in exile, we are separated from God, who has not decided yet to bring us home. And so, while there is still light and gladness even then and even in our lives, it is a diminished light and a diminished gladness, which is the same as the diminished role that the scroll of Esther itself maintains. Because it lacks God's name, a Megillat Esther is innately at a lower level of holiness than other scrolls and texts which contain that name. And finally, there is the perspective which is held by the majority of our rabbis, which brings us to the idea of Hester Panim, the hidden face of God. Hester Panim, the hidden face, implies that God has hidden God's self away inside the Megillah, but with careful inspection and knowledge of our texts and Jewish history, one can still see God peeking through the words and the actions. And where is the first place where you will see Hester Panim, the hidden face of God? Why? They use a pun, none other than in Esther panim, in the face of Esther. That's how she gets her name, Esther, Vechester, hidden Esther. God is in Esther, acting for the sake of God's beloved people. My teacher, Rabbi Michael Hatton, at the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies, gives a yearly lecture on this subject, this question of, is God missing or is God hidden? And so in his honor, I'd like to present a few of these moments from the book of Esther, which support that third perspective, that God is not missing from the Megillah at all, that God is in fact hiding in the Megillah. And when you know where to look, you will find God very quickly. The first example is in Esther 3:2. And all of the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed down and prostrated themselves before. It's a little early to do the booing. But I'll let you. Haman. For the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not down, nor prostrated himself before him. So here comes the question. A question that I think many people have an innate answer to, which is, why doesn't Mordecai bow down to Haman? You're not supposed to bow to anybody but God. Well, yes and. Because this is a slightly more problematic and complex question. The idea that Jews don't bow down to other human beings or to anyone other than God is not actually accurate. It's quite a common occurrence for Jews to bow down to important persons or royal figures throughout the Tanakh. For instance, in the book of Kings, the prophet Nathan bows down to David. Joseph's brothers bow down to him when he is in his Egyptian garb. And Jacob himself bows down 7 times before his brother, Esau. And even if it actually was forbidden, according to halakha, to bow down to someone who is not God, if it would endanger your life, or if it would endanger the lives of your entire community, God forbid, we all know that it would actually be permissible to bow down as part of the rabbinic and halakhic imperative of pikuach nefesh, to save people's lives. And Mordecai is a Torah scholar. So certainly he would have known that. So the answer, according to our rabbis, is found in the book of Daniel. Another story which takes place during the Babylonian exile, where King Nebuchadnezzar creates a gigantic golden statue, and he commands that every one of his subjects come before it, bow down to it, and worship it. And 3 Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are all thrown into a fiery furnace because they refuse to engage in idolatry. And so our rabbis from this story work out the halachic principle that it is not bowing which is an issue, but rather bowing when it leads to idolatry. And that often when one is prostrating oneself before a foreign entity, they might consider themselves to be a god, they might be holding an image of their god, or they might be dressed in the same way that their god is dressed. And so Haman, according to Rashi, thinks of himself as if he were a god. And Mordecai understood that to bow to him would be an act of idolatry because it would feed the God complex that Haman has. Which brings us back to that missing name of God here in the text. So whether you accept Rashi's premise that bowing would be an act of idolatry, or whether you hold firm to your idea that Jews do not bow to anyone other than their God, either way, you can't read this section of the Megillah where Mordecai refuses to bow without making God the center character of the story. And so God peeks out from the Megillah, making us aware of God's presence. Another peek can be found in Esther 3:7, where Haman casts his lots, which are called Pur, which is what gives our holiday its name, and they land upon the 13th day of Adar. And the story tells us that Haman cast these in the month of Nisan. So let's do a quick refresher on the months of the Jewish calendar. They go in order: Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, Av, Elu, Tishrei, Cheshvan, Kislev, Tevet, Shevat, Adar. And so this is the equivalent of saying, well, today is January 1st, and I'm going to choose a random date within the next calendar year to enact my grand vengeance. So let's roll the dice and see, and oh, look, I got December 31st. It's the longest possible delay that you can possibly get. A 12-month delay in a 12-month calendar year. We have 12 months between Haman hatching his plot, convincing the king to give permission for the pogrom, Esther's actions which give the Jews the right to defend themselves, the Jews nearly an entire year to get their act together, and not just that, to give the people of Persia nearly a full year to get it into their heads that joining into this act of violence is a bad idea. It gives Haman's allies nearly an entire year to say, you know what? This is a bad idea. Let's change our mind. Let's cancel this attack. Let's choose life over death. It's the best case scenario for everyone involved. It's an incredibly lucky roll of the dice. One might even call it miraculous. A third nod to the presence of the hidden God in Megillah can be found in Esther 4:1, where the evil plot has been hatched and Mordecai leaps into action, and the Megillah says, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the middle of the city, and he cried out a loud and bitter cry. And once again, eagle-eyed, canny readers of Jewish texts will immediately identify what God is doing, what Mordecai is doing, even if God is not there, because of the specific word which the Megillah uses in this moment, za'akah, the great cry. In Genesis, a za'akah is the cry of the victims of Sodom and Gomorrah who are calling forth for justice. In Exodus, the za'akah is the cry of the slaves who cry out to God for saving. And in the book of Psalms, when David cries out to be saved from Saul, he too gives forth a za'akah. The za'akah is the cry of those who need God to intervene. They need God to be there to save them. And for Mordecai to invoke it, for Mordecai to call out with that specific word, for the author of the Megillah to make that specific choice, once again, God becomes centered into our story, revealing once again to this canny reader that there is more than what meets the eye to what is going on. A quick lightning round of 3 more. In Esther 6:1, the king cannot sleep, and as my teacher points out, fools and drunks rarely have issues sleeping. So what could possibly be keeping this king awake? Zeresh, Haman's wife, in Esther 6:13, knows that Haman will fail because Mordecai belongs to the seed of the Jews. What does she know? Why would she be scared of Mordecai? Who is she actually afraid of? And then in Esther 8:17, the fear of the Jews, pachad hayehudim, falls upon many inhabitants of Babylon. Pachad hayehudim is a 2-word phrase which occurs only once in our entirety of Tanakh, which is right here. Anyone who heard that phrase would have gone, Pachad Yehudim? Isn't it supposed to be Pachad Hashem? Pachad Adonai? And so once again, the scroll through absence centralizes God in the story. And finally, the last example for the day is found in Esther 7:1, the beginning of the climactic confrontation between Esther and Haman. And this one is so simple that it is literally written into the trope itself. Vayavohu hamelech v'Haman. Boo. And in came the king. But which king? Which king are you supposed to be envisioning with that grand triumphant trope? Vayavohu hamelech. Hamelech. The God, the king. So in this moment, when Esther needs courage the most, when Esther needs the support the most, when Esther needs to find her voice the most, who is there by her side? Who comes in with her to see Haman? Why, none other than the God of her people. God is there when she needs God. God is there when we need God. Our scroll ends with La Yehudim Haita Ora v'Simcha v'Sason v'Ken Tihye Lanu. For the Jews, there was light, and there was joy, and there was gladness, and for us may it be so as well. Sunday morning, we will start our celebration with a festive and Freilichen carnival, and I cannot wait to see you all tomorrow morning. And on Monday night, we will continue our celebrations, reunited for Purim, for once again, in a little bit too long. And if none of this convinced you now, maybe on Monday night when you listen to our Megillah, it will convince you then. Shabbat Shalom.